You're live. Hello, everyone. We are live once again from Open Security Summit, and we're joined by David, and we have Matthias as well today. We're going to talk about multi-cloud compliance as code, how to secure your multi-cloud environments using compliance as code. Over to you.
Brilliant, thank you. Thanks for joining, everyone. I hope this session is going to be useful for you, especially for those who may be watching this in the future. My name is David Prince. I'm a cybersecurity consultant, and I spend a lot of my time, I guess, across delving into technical areas like this, as well as on the advisory side as well. So I won't go any further into my background. I'm joined by Matthias, and given it's you and I, Matthias, if you could perhaps introduce yourself. And what I'll do is, I guess we can start giving a few kind of introductions, and I can start throwing questions around compliance as code, perhaps starting with what it is. So if that sounds good, Matthias, would you like to give a quick intro?
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, my name is Matthias. I'm located in Germany, and I work for Salesforce as a platform security engineer. I already was asked many times about like Salesforce product details. I have no idea of those since I'm working like several levels under that on our cloud platform infrastructure. And in doing so, I also like tackle a lot of technical challenges in public cloud platforms.
Great, thank you. And I can see a few people have joined as well just in the last few minutes. Hi to those that have just joined. We're just starting the session now. It will be a good time actually now, if you wouldn't mind, if you can, just quickly say hi, introduce yourself, and if you've got any particular areas of interest or challenges that you're trying to grapple with at the moment around compliance as code and multi-cloud, please go ahead.
Hey everyone, Roop Silence here. I work for a consultancy called Ernst & Young in the cybersecurity team. And so I'm just here looking to see what the industry is doing for compliance and code, as with most of the other talks in the Open Security Summit.
Great, thank you. Great, let's make a start. So there are a limited number of us here. So I think, as I stated at the beginning, it would be good to perhaps start with some of the foundations first. And as a group, we can start to have a dialogue around compliance as code, how we can apply it to our multi-cloud environments. If we go down a direction of compliance as code as a capability, then great. If we take more of a kind of a multi-cloud security direction, then equally that's perfectly okay with me. So I want to start with, I guess, the origin of compliance as code, what it means, how it's being applied. So, Matthias, I think this is kind of close to your heart from what I'm hearing. Do you want to give a quick explanation for what it means?
To be honest, I'm not familiar with any like strict definition of whatever it means. What it means to me and what I've done in the past is basically like write verification as code that can then be applied in some kind of build environment and some kind of deploy pipeline whenever any infrastructure is being deployed to a cloud environment. So that obviously you could also like apply to the compliance area.
Sure. Any builds on that? I mean, that's kind of how I see it, creating, taking human form policy requirements and making them kind of machine readable, understandable in a systematic way that can be consumed by technology. Any builds on definition, whether formal or informal? Sounds like a big no. Let's talk about how we use it and what it is. I mean, it's so fast paced. What we're seeing with things like compliance as code. I mean, I think it originates as almost maybe a kind of a natural evolution of infrastructure as code. And we can kind of see the origins and perhaps where it's going in the future. It'd be good to perhaps talk about some of the benefits. We can start with some of the benefits, and then we can start about how we get those benefits and the challenges we need to overcome to get there. And for me, the benefits of compliance with code are huge, especially if described in the right way. I mean, when I think about securing multi-cloud environments, from an operational perspective, I think about the massive overheads required by people to map controls and manually validate the application of controls and to provide an understanding of what that means for risk. And that can require a huge number of people and expertise and can be a huge drain. And so one of the benefits I see around compliance as code is being able to create a capability that provides a means of embedding these assurances and checks within your DevSecOps CI/CD pipeline, and then kind of reap the benefits of DevSecOps, right? So if you can continuously validate and ensure the application of controls within your development and release management processes, then you can just have a very kind of cyclical and repeatable process for embedding security that is heavily automated. You can also get the benefits of things like immutable infrastructure. You know, if you have compliance as code backed off by infrastructure as code and other benefits from DevOps, then in the event of an issue, you can have confidence that you can just tear down your infrastructure and rebuild it. You can automate your testing. You know, so are there any other kind of benefits that we want to talk about that perhaps drive people towards compliance as code?
I would absolutely agree on that. I would be interested to hear what I learned in the past, and I probably also should do the obvious disclaimer that I'm like speaking from personal experience and not from my employer and all that stuff. So I would also be interested. I mean, once you have compliance as code, it's also often only a very small step to actually providing secure templates. I mean, if you know what you want to see in the templates, you can also just provide those, so people don't have to start from scratch. And once you provided that in a very accessible way, I actually also saw that it was much less relevant to do the checks, or that the checks resulted in a much lower error rate.
Yeah, it's a really good point. Really good point. Are there any builds on that?
So whose job is it to create those?
That's a very good question. Also what it means to make them like easily accessible. So I've seen central like architecture reference repositories in whatever version control system you're using that have worked well. And I mean, yeah, it depends. I've seen environments where basically everybody was actually contributing to those, and there was a team that had ownership, but they basically just ensured like code quality by means of pull requests. I've also seen other environments where it was more like part of a dedicated platform / middleware team to maintain those templates.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think what you're saying there, Matthias, is that the responsibility around defining, applying, and managing compliance as code is kind of fairly spread across the business, right? So, and you've got different viewpoints. So, you know, when I think about delivering change in a business and operating on DevSecOps, I think about control traceability and the oversight and kind of accountability around control traceability sits with an individual in the business, and that can be perhaps the CISO, it could be a transformation lead or a CTO, or perhaps someone in compliance, depending on the type of business. But then the building of, say, the BDD and the implementation of the capability, I don't know, Cucumber, for example, sits with someone else, perhaps in the DevSecOps team. But defining the features and the pseudocode and building that could be the responsibility of someone else. So, you know, there are a few individuals at play. I think one of the things I really love about compliance as code, and I guess DevSecOps as a whole, is that the collaborative and high performance nature of those teams is really amazing in terms of people efficacy. You know, you're kind of developing teams that know development, that know operations, that know security, and they're all cross-skilled. And the benefit of compliance as code is that as a team, you kind of all come together, you do your threat modeling, you identify what controls you need that may be kind of, I don't know, from the CSA or from the ISF or whatever, and you work together to kind of identify the key, I guess, manifests that you require for compliance as code. Does anyone have any kind of direct experiences with compliance as code?
Me, no, because I'm not in this field really. That's why I'm joining in this summit sessions. But there was a session last week or the week before where we looked at check and inspect. And it looked pretty easy to use, so why not use it? It's
Yeah, totally.
I think going back to that responsibility point you made, in many of the companies, it's really not a responsibility. It's just someone takes that initiative and starts it. Oh, that's what I have seen. What do you guys think about that?
I would also say.
Yeah, so go ahead.
I would also say it depends highly on the degree of DevOps, Agile, whatever transformation that was already there. So for example, the security engineering team that we have at the moment, it's called Platform Security Engineering. So it's quite clear that we're also expected to engineer something, which also means we need to collaborate closely with like the product and platform engineers, and basically integrate into the typical software development lifecycle that we have and into the agile culture. So using the same tools, speaking the same language, doing the same stand-ups or whatever we're having. So it also, in my experience, depends heavily on the degree of how this transformation has already been going and whether the security department is still like somewhere else in an ivory tower or actually integrated into the engineering org.
Yeah, I think there's a really good kind of maturity point there. I think you're not really going to, maybe a bold statement, but you're not really going to implement compliance as code if you don't already have a form of DevOps or DevSecOps capability, because it is the only way you can really implement compliance as code as a kind of a byproduct of having those cross-functional capabilities together in a DevOps capability.
Or if you're lucky, you have some engineers that are really interested in security and they do it.
Yeah, and then you apply it, but it's not a kind of a systemic enduring capability. But to be fair, I mean, often the way in which you would create the business case for investing in this capability is having tried and tested it and proving the benefits.
I've also found engineers to be the ones that dig up the most edgy edge cases of some technology, which is, often related to security, like application security, and they can dig up such weird specification details or what's possible or not. And it's really funny because every now and then they come up in our Slack channel with like, hey folks, is this and this, is that like, can that be abused somehow? And then basically the whole team is excited to jump on that because it's the weirdest of edge cases and we try to make something of it.
Brilliant.
And how do we do multi-cloud?
I mean, for me, that's kind of one of the big growth areas for compliance as code. You know, in many cases, if you look at Terraform or whatever, you have to still specify the cloud platform directly where you want to apply compliance as code. You don't have a from what I've seen, kind of a single kind of facade where you would have your compliance as code that would then automatically just apply it to the cloud platform. You have to be fairly specific to where you want to apply it. And I think that's definitely going to evolve over time. One of the challenges that I see with compliance as code, and it'd be great to perhaps talk about it, is where do you start in implementing compliance as code? And given all the things that you can check, where do you start to build the manifest? Where do you apply your time and effort at the beginning? Because there's so much you can do with it. So how should you approach it from the beginning?
I think for me, it makes sense as soon as your infrastructure as code cloud journey begins. But ideally, I don't think most organizations have gone through that because I think the compliance code is naturally an afterthought. So now they're all trying to play catch up, aren't they?
Yeah, I think to a degree. I guess one of the benefits of compliance as code is it's kind of hung off the back of the coat rails of infrastructure as code. So, you know, a lot of it's already kind of there in terms of the understanding of the capability. But yeah, I think one of the challenges is you've got within an organization, and I came across this recently with a business, they operated the ISF control framework, and they had recently established a DevOps, DevSecOps capability where they wanted to employ compliance as code within that. And there was this kind of huge divergence between the ambiguity of high-level policy statements and then how you turn that into kind of prescriptive, more binary checks. And actually, there's a lot of effort required to translate high-level policy requirements into something that is almost machine readable and more transactional in nature that you can then just embed and check. And where kind of one of the challenges you see is organizations that go, we're going to do compliance as code, are not really understanding the huge effort you've got to do to actually convert policy into, say, behavioral driven development. There's quite a bit of effort there. With that comes opportunity to collaborate and prioritize where you want to focus. But I haven't really seen much of a, here's an approach that you can follow to focus on the most critical things. But I guess when you think about it, there are some checks and some controls that are naturally susceptible to compliance as code, that are immediate candidates for it being applied. So if anyone's looking for, I guess, a quick win or to prove the benefits of compliance as code, then you can look at the controls that don't really change much. So you can look at service accounts and permissions. You can look at firewall rules and security groups. These are the things that are less fluid in nature and are easier to check. But does anyone have any kind of thoughts on where you start applying compliance as code?
Personally, I think taking like a huge framework and trying to put this into code out of a sudden would be a bad idea.
Agree.
Because it would probably like result in like a load of errors for engineers. Probably, I mean, we all know frameworks and standards. Probably some of that is not the most critical items. So what I've made good experiences with is basically just starting your regular reviews. And I mean, it depends on the organization, but you earlier mentioned like do your threat modeling, do all of that. But basically, like whenever you identify an issue, try to create an automated check for that or improve a template or training material. So basically follow an iterative and in itself agile approach, which I think works well together.
Yeah, I like that. That's actually a really good idea, is kind of take what you're already doing and sort of gradually transition some of those things. I think is kind of what you're describing there, if I'm not wrong.
Yep, exactly. Yeah.
I agree with your point, David, you raised about policies being too high level for compliance and code to be accurately achieved. So I've seen this done before in larger organizations is they'll create, they'll have a policy that will then be supplemented by a pattern. Yep. And your pattern would be lower level, but would also be agnostic to technology provider. So like if you're looking at cloud, for instance, and you're looking at the building of a compute instance, so EC2, and then you've got the associated versions of Azure and Google, the pattern would be relevant to all of those. And then what you have is the specific vendor control would be a hardening guide. And it's the hardening guide that would be used by your developers that then sort of act against compliance as code. That's one way I've seen it. I'm just curious to see if anyone else has experienced any other ways of managing compliance as code, whether there are any better ways or any different ways that it can be done.
No, I've seen that as well. Like in the good cases, if I got your introduction right, I think you might even have an idea where and what you've seen there. I mean, in the ideal case, the hardening guide has like an appendix that has even like a check script or templates already attached. So it's basically ready to use without having to translate a hardening PDF into code first.
Yeah, I think the hardening guide tends to give, it's almost like a work instruction, right? How do you produce a certain piece of, or how do you, if it's an EC2 instance on AWS, how do you build a secure build? But then that secure build is referenced back against the pattern, which references either the business values or the policy, high level goals and principles that are outlined by most probably information security teams.
Well, the thing I like about this conversation right now is actually we're talking about lots of inputs to inform what the machine readable kind of BDD compliance as code kind of snippets are going to be. You know, there's policy, there's patterns, there's guidelines, there's kind of more kind of hardening guidelines with that. There's your individual threat model. All of these are inputs to help kind of define something fairly prescriptive. But that's actually quite a good approach in terms of bridging the gap between ultimately what is the policy at an organizational level down to what needs to be applied for a particular product or platform, you know, infrastructure. I kind of like that kind of collecting a repository of inputs that are necessary to then develop compliance as code. I think there's another consideration, which is, I guess, more of a quick win. So I like to take the kind of the 80-20 principle. You know, what kind of quick wins are there that can just mitigate 80% of the risk? And I guess when I think about that, I think of, you know, let's take the OWASP, you know, top 10 or whatever, and let's just then apply the corresponding checks for that, because we know that irrespective of what our policy says, irrespective of the patterns we have and the guidelines we follow, these are the things we know we need to be checking. And then for the 20%, which may be more kind of systemic and strategic in nature, let's do the individual threat modeling and really understand actually what applies to our individual context. I wonder if there's a repository there that kind of already exists, I suppose, that you can embed in your CI/CD pipeline that kind of looks at those obvious points of vulnerability, particularly across multi-cloud. So, you know, permission or retention of data like storage. It's not something I've seen, to be honest, is that kind of ready to use repository of compliance as code.
So I've seen translations of that for different cloud environments, but not necessarily into code. So I think I've also seen like different like checks in code for different cloud environments, but not having that in a super unified framework or something like that.
Okay. I'm kind of making an action to myself to do a bit of research and see what work has already been done in industry that can be consumed by others, because, you know, compliance as code the idea has been around for a long time, but it's only just becoming viable because now we're seeing more multi-cloud, we're seeing more complex environments, and we're seeing more cloud overall. And so the application of it is just far more attractive, I guess. So yeah, okay, that's really, really interesting. I guess the other thing we need to think about is when you implement compliance as code, you're running it. Well, then what? Things will fail. Things will be flagged. What do you do? You know, no doubt when you first implement compliance as code, there's going to be a whole raft of false positives or genuine things you need to investigate. I guess there's that kind of embedding the overall process. Are there any kind of thoughts from you in terms of what that process looks like when you're starting to get back a load of results, a load of data?
I mean, that my answer would be it depends, and I would loop that back to a question like where do you all see compliance as code usually get applied, like in what type of system and which type of deployment step or something like that?
Yes, good question. Good question. I'm loath to kind of jump in with responses. Does anyone have a thought?
I mean,
Doing
I can
a
also
proof of concept with a little part of one project first, maybe to understand.
Yes, maybe I also explain a little bit where I'm coming from. So, for example, in our environment, there's several like most there's different Git environments, different Git systems, and then we basically have pretty much every CI CD service that is imaginable in use in some case. And like we also run our own custom CI environment. So basically like we can't even apply everything everywhere at the same time because it's just such a broad field. So I was also thinking, okay, like what we often do is like basically like provide templates and work with engineering departments, and then also focus on monitoring the actual environment, not so necessarily like as a blocking step in deployment, but having compliance as code more like as monitoring, as okay, that monitoring is code, but that we develop monitoring checks instead of like blocking compliance checks in a pipeline.
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah, so your application is more on the kind of the monitoring side. I think if I were to think about, just get to your point, Matthias, about where do you apply it, I guess with my leadership hat on, I'd be thinking, well, I would apply it where I can get the most benefit, where I can reduce most risk, where I can cut down on cost the most. So which of my projects or initiatives or operations platforms I run, which one drains the most time, has the most number of issues, and actually perhaps carries to a degree material risk. And so if I'll be thinking about, okay, if I take those criteria, then actually there's a subset of, say, 5 initiatives where actually end to end I can get most benefits from compliance as code. So I'm going to pick one of those as a candidate, and I'm going to start to transition the security controls, the checks, everything within compliance as code as much as I can, to the point where you can actually then, as a kind of an end-to-end kind of provisioning perspective, you can showcase the benefits of rapidly identifying issues, like compliance issues, and resolving them, being able to then demonstrate the different actions you can take if there is a failure, like spinning down some infrastructure or rebuilding. And also, I guess, from a risk perspective and from a time perspective, I'd look to try and quantify how much time security teams are actually spending on a particular initiative, and then how much time it actually takes when you've got compliance as code running. Because they're for me a kind of, if I wanted to apply it anywhere, I wouldn't apply it on a complex system that isn't that valuable to the business, because you're just not going to get the focus and the benefits clearly articulated where you can then apply it more. I guess it's kind of me rambling a bit, but I'd be definitely keen to invest time on the more important platforms for compliance as code, because other benefits are like, when you do compliance as code, you get kind of automatic inherent version control. If anyone makes a change to a compliance with code kind of manifest, you've got some new checks in there, for example, automatically that can trigger a build in a test environment. And in that test environment, can automatically check if the control works and everything still functions. And if that's successful, then it can go to be committed to production, and then automatically be built into the next release. And being able to demonstrate all the benefits across that whole chain, for me, is probably the most attractive thing with compliance as code. Any thoughts, builds?
Yeah, agree with that. I think even root suppliers don't even need to change much. I think
You're breaking up a bit. Sorry, I can't hear you.
Can you start again? Oh.
Sorry, no, I can't hear you.
You can write in the chat if you want. I can voice that for you.
Good idea.
Oh, okay. He's going to change the headsets. In the meantime, so David, you said investing more in the big impactful projects. But is that a risk? Why don't you start small? Why would
Yeah, it's a really good point, and it's really around kind of a balance of the benefits that you want to get and the risk you're willing to take on to get there. So if I were to, I guess I'd probably articulate better. If I were to showcase the benefits of compliance with code, I'd showcase those benefits on a critical or significant platform. In terms of kind of learning how to use it and applying it, I definitely want some kind of sandpit or a smaller project with less risk. But then I'd kind of, in the background, take those kind of the things you learn and the processes you create and refine. I wouldn't be showcasing those things. That would be kind of background working. And then I'd start to transition that into a major platform. So yeah, I guess I wouldn't technically start at a major platform, but I'll definitely use it to showcase the benefits.
Understood. That makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of around the business case of compliance as code, but maybe worth talking about.
Can you guys hear me now?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, great. I don't know what happened there. I've got these new Bose headphones. I think something happens when it's over Bluetooth and I connect them to two devices. But I think one thing I was saying, lost a bit of trail of thought here, but it was interesting when you were talking about the quantification of risk. And I think you mentioned something about quantifying effort.
Yeah.
And then also when thinking in my head, crossing that back to the 80-20 split you said about spending most of your time on the OWASP top 10 and then referencing back to threat models. I think the quantification is easy when you have a reference of like the top 10, right? Because the level of detail that's there, but it quickly becomes ambiguous when you start doing threat modeling because you're almost looking for something you don't really know that's there. You don't really know what you're going to find. And so time spent is valuable, but again, you can't really measure that against anything, or it's just difficult. And I also found it quite interesting. I think on one of the CISO talks yesterday, a couple of them were talking about how for each sprint they give 25% of time, or they allocate 25% of sprint time to security tasks. I think that might be a useful way of quantifying developer time to security activities and doing things like addressing OWASP top 10 flaws, and also doing threat modeling activity as well as some of the other things they should be doing. But I don't know, I just thought I'd say that's quite interesting. I think the difficult thing with developers, although they have a day job in actually building something that works and makes a business money, the quantification of the value of security is a challenge for them.
Yeah, I think they're really, really good points, actually, and they're definitely worth considering in terms of how you quantify and what you can quantify. Because everyone's got a kind of slightly different opinion on it, and obviously that's okay. I tend to go down the route of if it's easily or reasonably easy to quantify and it's valuable, then quantify it. There's going to be a lot of effort to try and quantify something that perhaps isn't that critical, then you don't quantify it. And the data points carry different significance, different levels of significance for different businesses. So some businesses are, they're cost driven. And if you're getting a lot of kind of change happening in maybe the transformation part of a business, then I guess I'd be looking at quantifying time and effort on issues rather than quantifying other types of benefits. But then other organizations will have a slightly different focus. So yeah, it's really interesting in terms of what it is you use to articulate benefits and quantify risk.
Have you seen any approaches with any of the organizations you've worked with and how they quantify risk in that space?
Yeah, I mean, it's really mixed. I guess a few general points that I've seen. So frankly speaking, I don't see that many organizations properly embedding quantitative risk analysis. At best, I see qualitative risk analysis supplemented with some quantitative data points. So, but that is changing. So I'm over the years hearing more and more people going down the quantitative route, which is great to see. But it's quite rare, to be honest. And I'm in the consulting space as well. It's quite rare that where I see quantitative risk being used, to be honest. And also because when you're engaging with boards, senior leaders, I've got to be careful what I say here, but often it's, if you can articulate something that is common sense, we should be, that's kind of enough to win them over, as long as there's confidence that it's the right thing to do. It's more when there are multiple correct answers that you perhaps need to quantify things a bit more. But I guess where I've seen approaches for compliance as code, the main drivers for me tend to be around the efficacy of the security function. So because you can reuse so much stuff, you're not repeating processes, and that stuff's easy to quantify, particularly if you're in a business that has a change function within it. Because in the security team, you may not be able to quantify that much, but if you've got transformation leaders, heads of portfolios, and people who are leading big programs, those data points are really easy to get in terms of how much time and effort is being spent on activities. And if you can say that it's, you're taking 25% of your effort on activities X, Y, Z, as an arbitrary example, and with compliance of code, we can easily demonstrate that effort is actually now 10%, and you've got 15% extra to do other stuff, either to security or reallocated somewhere else, then that's massively compelling for organizations that are cost-driven. And frankly, with the current pandemic, most are and will be.
So it's not just the security benefit that you're getting. You're getting other cost reductions.
You're getting cost reductions, I think, for delivery, but you're also getting, to kind of separate compliance and security, you're getting major compliance benefits because you're getting very kind of easily traceable controls, very easy to validate controls on a continuous basis. You don't have to rely on your quarterly reviews or independent internal audit to kind of come in. So yeah, compliance, security, delivery costs.
I absolutely agree on that. I mean, and if you want to come into or if you want to reach a place where you can actually do anything as code, you need to have a very, very standardized and automated and orchestrated environment. And all of that basically requires that all of that results in what you just said: security, compliance, increased agility, cost savings, all of that.
Awesome. I guess there's the other benefit, which is quite cool, which I do think about quite a lot, and less perhaps quantifiable, but there is a shortage of security talent to some degree, and there is no shortage of capacity for people to be upskilled and trained. Organizations that are, I guess, embracing newer ways of working and technologies that are more cutting edge in nature, you're going to attract more talent, frankly, because it's genuinely interesting stuff. Genuinely. So there's that kind of benefit around retention of people and attraction of new talent.
Yeah, I agree. Interesting to think about where responsibility lies in this conversation. Whether it's I suppose I'm sort of going off topic here and going into the debate of where the DevSecOps role should originate from. Should it come from a security governance type person, or should it come from a developer?
So are you talking kind of accountability?
Or no, just responsibility, right? So like, if you're looking at someone who verifies compliance as code, may actually write the patterns and hardening guides I was talking about.
Yep.
And also someone who quantifies that risk and helps bring those messages to business leaders. That in itself sounds like a job role. I don't think it's fair to expect that from a developer. But then at the same time, how does that role connect in with other developer activities where they know their application best, and they may actually know how to secure it best. So I suppose, it's a question of where does a DevSecOps role sort of sit best, and how. I suppose I'm just trying to talk. I'm trying to speak my thoughts here, right? I don't have the answer.
Really good. Carry on.
I don't really have the answer to it. Just keen to see. I've seen it from one way where actually I've worked in both angles, right? I've worked in identity and access management, where I sort of, without really knowing, assumed a DevOps role and done security work. And now I've also, and I'm going through it now, where I'm in more of an assurance or a governance angle, working in a DevOps or DevSecOps space, trying to get organizations to build things securely. And so I think there's benefits from both sides. If you're doing it from the governance and assurance, you get more clout in what you say tends to get listened by more people. If you're doing it from the developer side, you're sort of told to stay in your own box and work within the application you're using. And then if there's anything that you're doing, whether it's right or wrong, there's a challenge in standardizing it across the rest of the project and the rest of the organization. So I'm just curious to see sort of, what thoughts you had on that and what challenges that you faced.
It's a bit of a culture thing, and I think it depends on the organization itself. But that's me.
You're kind of also describing all the different characters that have a level of involvement with compliance as code and more generally DevSecOps. And it's quite a web of different individuals with different responsibilities. When I was kind of listening to what you were saying and just kind of reeling off your thoughts, I guess I was trying to map in my head, if you've got the kind of security ecosystem of people, who is doing what in compliance as code compared to the broader business. And I guess I was going off on my own tangent as I was listening to you around what is the starting point ultimately, and then how does that feed into the kind of the operational doing, and then validating for assurance, and then kind of reporting back up, give assurance and spot gaps. And kind of starting with like, you have to work with the business to get your business requirements from your different lines of business, and that is used to kind of develop the security requirements that the business should apply that align to an acceptable level of risk the business wants to take in pursuit of its goals that it wants to achieve. And then those requirements have to be consumed by, say, an architecture function that is governed by a design authority of some kind, and from that has to come guidelines with support from security around, okay, what does this mean in reality? And that's when you kind of get into the engineering space around actually applying. And so when I think about the different kind of roles you described around who goes to the business and starts talking about risk and who applies and who tests, I would see kind of in terms of defining compliance as code requirements, I would see that as a collaborative effort within DevSecOps. But it would be, if I were to have a responsibility somewhere, it would be on the kind of the security practitioner working with the developers to then achieve what's required with the guidance of the security practitioner. Because one of the challenges we see is there aren't that many security people that can code, even pseudocode. There isn't that much out there. No. But there is this need to work together for sure. But then when it comes to applying it, I'd absolutely see that as the engineers, the developers applying it, because what they're applying is already approved and understood. But the benefit of compliance as code is you can separate the assessment criteria with the test itself. So you can have different people applying compliance as code to people actually testing that it's working, which is great for compliance because you've got the separation of duties. But then, to be honest, overall, I would have someone in the security function taking an aggregate view of how all the different platforms and operations and initiatives are aligning to compliance as code, where are the failures, where are the gaps. And that person will be the person kind of reporting through the CISO function. And also through the transformation function if the business is big enough to have that. So there's lots of different players that have a role to play. I do wonder if there's some kind of published like map of how all these people come together, because that'd be really useful, I think.
Yeah, interesting point. I think you just painted the picture for the most ideal scenario, but I've not seen that.
No.
Probably what gives consultants their jobs.
Yeah, exactly.
I've seen an interesting paper from, I think, back in America, the Department of Defense are releasing some DevSecOps guides. I don't know if it touches upon structural responsibility and maybe target operating models and such, but I'll have a look at that. I think it's like a 100-page document. But then I think that it varies between industry, what you've just spoken about.
Yeah.
You may get that in finance or private sector, but if you're a startup, maybe you can't afford to have all the structures.
Oh yeah, if you start up, I guess, well, that's one person.
Yeah, well, you just have to rely on your developers to be doing the right thing.
Yeah, for sure. And if you're heavily regulated and you're in financial services, you're more likely to have a kind of a change transformation part of the business and more structure. So yeah, I think that's really important to recognise what works for what businesses and what operating models.
I mean, my spiel was always to say like, hey, DevOps, DevSecOps that originated in startups because they didn't have different departments to do everything. So 1, 2, 3 people had to do everything, and they needed to sort. They were sitting at like one table together, and I always say like this was not like some amazing concept that someone thought of and then implemented it. It basically like had to be done that way. And then people also saw that there are benefits.
Yeah, I think I agree to some of that. Even DevSecOps as well, right? So there's DevOps engineers building things insecurely, and then having your Facebooks and Ubers, not to single them out, but I'm sure there's a whole list of other companies that have suffered breaches. But when we see them on the news for insecure cloud environments or insecure applications, I think quite naturally the DevSecOps role creates itself, much like how the DevOps role has, with developers trying to do many things.
Yeah. Yeah, I think about those breaches a lot, and I guess as many of us do. And it's not that the capability and the skill isn't there. It's often we're struggling to identify what's most important and therefore where we need to focus time. Because Uber, for example, they'll have a great suite of capabilities and people, like no doubt about it. And they will have a high-performing cross-functional DevSecOps team, but perhaps they don't really understand, the person who's advising on risk perhaps doesn't understand the actual value chain of that business, and therefore what component parts of that business are most critical and what threats are imposed on that, and then how to respond.
Yeah, so, well, maybe they are. Maybe they're just prioritizing business value of applications, getting better apps to customers like you and I, instead of making sure they're secure.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's tough to speculate. There are lots of reasons, but yeah, absolutely, that's a valid one. Are there any other areas of interest around compliance as code? I know this is a fairly fluid conversation because there's a limited number of us, but is there anything of particular interest we haven't really touched on?
For me, there was a very good insight in other experiences. There were some interesting new points in there, but I mean, in general, that like it was like my experiences as well. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for sharing your experiences. Really helpful.
I feel like we haven't touched upon multi-cloud aspect of it too much, but I'm not an expert in this field, so I don't know.
Yeah, that's a really good point. We've not really touched on how we apply compliance as code to multi-cloud, and I mean, arguably that's one of the most advantageous places to apply compliance as code with the different platforms and capabilities that are out there.
I would first ask about any successful experiences with multi-cloud then, because I've seen that always as a very tricky thing to achieve.
That's probably not something we can fix in the session.
Well, I mean, multi-cloud is fraught with potential challenge. I speak with organizations all the time, and the reality is lots of organizations don't have a multi-cloud strategy, but they are multi-cloud just because that's what's happened. And particularly the bigger businesses where there isn't a single owner of cloud, everyone's got their own agenda. It can sometimes get political. But the end result is you have an estate which is comprised of GCP, AWS, Azure, VMware, IBM, all flavors. And the consequence is, how on earth do you manage security for that? For something that's already there, you don't have the luxury of being able to properly plan. You've got to act to some degree.
Yeah. Okay. I'm totally with that. That's my experience as well. And like looping back a bit, like the best experience with doing anything as code was when there was like a properly standardized process, and I haven't seen that with multi-cloud yet. It's more like the wild zoo of all the different cloud animals that you find out there.
Yeah.
Same here.
That in itself has opened huge opportunity in industry for startups to start plugging those gaps. Really, particularly from kind of an identity and privilege management perspective, with the thousands of different permissions that you can apply. That's really hard in multi-cloud when you've got discrepancies between different permission sets. So yeah, I guess where I would see compliance as codes to be applied to multi-cloud is definitely, I would say, to I'm just reeling off potential benefits, so do chip in, and I'm just obviously speaking off the top of my head, but if you don't have compliance as code and you operate multi-cloud environments, you're going to have a higher emphasis on the individual skills of your people, right? So if you don't have compliance as code to kind of reproduce and repeat this process, then you're going to need more expertise in all the different cloud platforms, and that's not easy to achieve with organizations that don't have budget to hire. So Checkoff, is that that's a capability?
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
So yeah, compliance is going to
last week. They had a session, Bridge Crew.
Oh yeah, I remember seeing that. Yeah.
Barak. Yeah.
Ah yeah, so this audience is probably quite familiar with it. Yeah.
Not really. I didn't know about it before the session, so it was.
Yeah,
good.
that's everybody like that I shared that with. Yeah. He says, oh, I haven't heard of that, and so I did not any production stuff with their tools yet, but what I've done testing wise is super promising.
when I read that, I just think of Star Trek.
Yep.
Is that Checkoff.io?
I'm not sure.
Just paste
Let
there.
me find.
Is it this one?
Yes, that's it.
Yeah. So it's exactly that. Without this capability in this process, to have an effective operation or security operations for multi-cloud, you're going to need a lot of people, a lot of different expertise. Whereas actually, you'd much rather get the real benefit of those individuals' kind of knowledge and expertise rather than focusing on fairly cyclical activities. You embed compliance as code, and I guess across multi-cloud, where it becomes particularly useful is where you start to build those checks for the vulnerabilities most commonly associated with cloud, which for me is going to be kind of permissions of security with security groups, storage, and then on the kind of the web application side.
It's an interesting point you raised there with relying on the skill of people, because then you're also relying on them not to get hit by a bus or then not leave the company. and have them replaced by someone who, not that the person replacing them may not be as good, but they may not know what the other person's logical thought was when they built those environments. And to me, when I paint that picture in my head, I think, right, it only just builds a use case for involving security governance teams to produce or help produce, with architects and with developers, patterns and hardening guides and methodologies, so that when those people leave, they have something to look at as a reference for what they should be maintaining and building.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And then that stuff is repeatable, it's consumable, and then you can make the best out of the people that you've got. Supply chain needs a lot of work, for example.
But that challenge, right, it's probably one of the hardest ones in the industry in cloud. But then you've got the other, if you stick with one cloud provider, you're at risk of vendor lock-in. There's a low likelihood of AWS running out of business, but I mean, there was a low likelihood of a pandemic with COVID-19. It's crippling some organizations, and I think, if organizations rely on one single cloud provider and something were to happen to them, it could do just the same.
Yeah, very, very true. I mean, the vendor lock-in risk is definitely less than what it used to be. But where I tend to see that risk is where organizations build their cloud applications that is too heavily tied to specific cloud capability and isn't loosely coupled in its architecture. And that is more of an organizational challenge rather than cloud challenge. Where I think years ago, it used to be the other way around.
I think it also heavily depends what you're doing with the cloud environment. I mean, if you have a standard platform as a service environment where you basically deploy containers, you have a standardized ingress solution that maybe even does load balancing and authentication and all of that for you, it doesn't, it's super easy to do that multi-cloud. But if you do like cloud native applications and really leverage a high number of cloud services that are available, I mean, AWS, I think, has shown to which extremes that can be pushed with like the building an application with 18 different AWS services, and which is way more effort than doing something else, but you can also get super scalable things out of that. So if you build an application with an AWS SNS message back queue in the backend or something like that, it's difficult to translate to other environments. And it would also be difficult to switch that over somewhere.
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, and the application of compliance with code, it's almost universal, right? Because you've also got things like Kubernetes and containers and microservices that you apply this stuff to, cloud, multi-cloud, microservices. I mean, that's the power of it.
Folks, I have to jump off. I've got another call I need to get onto. But thank you for your time. I enjoyed this very honest, transparent conversation.
Great, thanks.
You.
Have a good day.
Thank you so much for your contribution.
Awesome. I think Philippe, you've just joined.
Yeah, so I was in the call. Sadly, I don't know what you already discussed. Couldn't hear that. But yeah.
Sorry, go on.
Yeah, we talked before a little bit, but we are facing the challenge of going multi-cloud. We already were thinking about that. I mean, that's a basic decision. Most of people is afraid of just getting locked in, but you can go full Netflix and go, okay, I'm just going AWS and that's it. And just use everything very tailored to your specific environment, and you will be great also. Yeah, it's not like it's going to be bad, but and you can really take advantage of many of the things, but you need to be big as Netflix for doing that sometimes. So it's kind of but anyway, it's sometimes we do extensive use of Terraform, and And yeah, for sure, you end up doing and having some examples of trying to get some compliance in your code and trying to get the same thing in many clouds. I cannot say in every cloud, but in many clouds, it's definitely a challenge. It's definitely a challenge. We've been trying to add kind of more testing, so we can have both ways and being also have tests for a compliance in a proper way, but still has been a challenge for some time for us.
And where's that challenge for you coming from?
Well, most of the times, time itself. Writing tests takes time, and getting compatible tests or tests that can be ported easily sometimes is a challenge. That's one of the, I think it's one of the most pressing challenges. And yeah, sometimes you don't have the exact same flavor of thing between different providers. So, I mean, maybe, but you cannot achieve the same thing, specifically exactly the same thing. So the test needs to be a little bit different.
Yeah, agreed.
And
I think that's a really key development point and an evolution point for compliance as code.
Yeah, definitely. But and the tooling is evolving also, so that's also a challenge. I mean, the evolution of tools, it's getting better and better. So that's one of the things that if you chose a tool, for example, if you chose CloudFormation for AWS, it's one thing, but if you choose Terraform and try to use it multi-cloud, that's a very different thing. You should test differently, and of course it's going to take more time sometimes for doing one tests using one platform and the other.
And are you finding the benefits that when you develop these tests and you embed some compliance as code in your pipeline, are you actually realizing the benefits of it being kind of reused and automated or not?
Yeah, definitely.
Great. Okay.
Definitely. Yeah, definitely. There is a benefit on doing that. It depends a lot. Sometimes it depends on the kind of test you are trying to use. Sometimes we use inspect testing for doing very specific tests in the platform level. And sometimes we end using Terra test for doing Terraform testing and having improving everything at a different level. So you can mix and match the test depending on what you're trying to achieve, right?
Yeah.
Also, of course, yeah, it depends also if you want to use Kubernetes or something related to Kubernetes. There is another level of testing that you can add. So everything is kind of mix and match for all the platforms that we're using right now.
And what is really helpful. Do you have an approach that you follow that I guess ultimately derives the things you need to create for compliance as code, or do you kind of have a collection of here are the things we need to probably create? Let's just pick some that are easy. Do you have a kind of a defined methodology or approach for how you create compliance as code manifests?
We normally try to follow standards depending on the standard we're trying to. We kind of have a base of something that is difficult to get, which is we have some things in FreeBSD, which is a challenge of sometimes to get into the cloud because you need to resort to in the case of AWS, for example, in EC2 instances, because there is no lower layer than that. You cannot implement jails, for example, which is a very cool tool that you have in FreeBSD implemented in other places. So, and in that case, it's kind of difficult because, for example, you don't have CIS benchmarking for that. We are kind of in a parallel project trying to create a benchmark for BSD, which has been for a long time without the benchmarking for that. We're trying to adapt some of the benchmarks from Red Hat and from hardened BSD. But yeah, tooling has been a problem in that particular case. So we adapt our own tests or end adapting some of the tests from other places or from other architectures or operating systems. That's for more for the platform thing.
Yeah. So it sounds like if I were, based on kind of what I've heard from you just now, if I were to pick one of the issues you're facing or challenges, it's two things, but I think they're part of the same issue is the time you have available and the need to apply so many kind of customizations, tweaks for the platforms. Is that right?
Yeah. Basically, the support from the test is also one of the things that, for example, if choosing platforms, sometimes you need to extend the inspect actually and get proper testing and things that they are not supported. I face sometimes, for example, one of the things that inspect didn't have was a proper test for, I don't know, SSH, for example. And the algorithms that were using there were kind of very generic. And if you try to go for more hardened algorithms for testing SSH, it wasn't supported yet. So when, for example, we extended that to support better algorithms and better protocols and more modern ones, right? And that was a real challenge because, okay, we want to achieve that. We want to get better support for more standard and stronger algorithms, but we need to change the tool itself and do the updating of that. So yeah, it's a long way and you face challenges along the way.
Yeah, for sure. That's really insightful. So at the very lowest level, you're finding kind of gaps and issues that you then have to fill with the time that you have, kind of very kind of technical in nature.
Yeah, if you see the holistic approach should be that, I mean, there is no one tool that does everything. Even when we are facing the multi-cloud environments is even worse. I mean, you try to rely as much as you can in Terraform, but that's for one of the sides. And then if you try to get as many things as in the compliance as code, then you certainly are facing some other different troubles. But yeah, using proper inspect, proper Terraform, proper Terra testing, and doing inspect tests and trying to get as much as you can in as code is what we're trying to do in our CD pipelines, right? CI/CD pipelines.
Yeah.
Do you have hands-on experience with HashiCorp's Sentinel?
Not yet. I don't think it was in our horizon right now, because we are kind of focused on trying to getting a more portable Kubernetes thing, which is also a challenge because we decided to go for KOps. That's one of the things that also is kind of because, of course, GC has the tooling for Kubernetes right away, and Azure has been having a very good support for Kubernetes, but it wasn't at the beginning in AWS, and you needed to resort to tools like KOps. And yeah, you can use KOps in all the platforms. So we are trying to figure it out, but the tooling itself is like primitive sometimes. And yeah, Sentinel looks like could be a good choice, but we didn't have the time to focus on that.
Matthias, are you looking for particular experiences for that tool? Because a colleague of mine has experience and probably just talk you through how they found it.
No, I would just be interested, like how much you can actually cover with it. I'm a little bit in the same spot as Philippe. Like having seen it, capabilities look nice, but just not broad enough to spend a lot of time trying to make it work. So yeah, real life experiences, how far you can actually get with Sentinel. It's something that was just interesting to me. I don't have like a current use case or anything, but would have been interested to hear if.
I can ask the question and pass on some feedback if you like.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah, no problem. No problem. Is there anything further we want to explore at this point? I know we've got kind of the full 2 hours allocated to the session, but my kind of feeling is we're gradually coming to a close unless there's particular things we want to be talking about that we haven't yet.
I'm happy with whatever you choose. It's not set in stone that we have to have 2-hour sessions.
Yeah, it's kind of aimed at kind of Philippe and Matthias, I suppose. Is there anything further you want to get out of the time we've got left?
All good from my side.
Yeah, sadly, I couldn't join earlier, so I lost some of the discussion earlier. But I'm good after now. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, I think in that case, Matthias, I'll ask the question around Sentinel, and I'll let you know. I don't know if you're in the Slack channel or.
Yes, I am since an hour roughly now.
Awesome. Right. Okay. In that case, I'll just ping you a quick message.
Thank you. Yeah, that would be awesome.
No problem. All right. I think we'll leave it there. I mean, I hope you guys have enjoyed the session, and thank you for providing the input. Really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thanks for organizing this.
Just a little last question. I don't know if you talk about cloud conformity at all.
Say again?
Cloud conformity.
But aren't they a company?
Yeah, they have like some governance and knowledge base and solutions about the compliance and governance and around cloud. They have like best practices for ruling for AWS or.
No experience here, unfortunately.
Now I think it's bought right now for Trend Micro. I think he bought it in the last days, but they have lots of knowledge base and solutions in the open. Of course, they have some closed ones, but they have good knowledge base about this conformity.
That's great. Thank you. Yeah, I've not been to this website before, to be honest. I've never come across it in all the cloud work I've done. I'll definitely take a look. It looks quite comprehensive.
I remember doing third-party assurance on them.
Yes.
Yes. But they were very, very new back then. Cool.
Awesome. That's great. Thank you very much.
Sure.
Have a good one, guys.
Have a good one.